Hi, friend. Welcome to Rainy Tales, a quiet place for gentle stories told beneath the sound of rain. Now, let's begin tonight's story. It had been raining since early evening, the kind of soft, unhurried rain that turns everything outside into a watercolor painting. The world beyond the window was blurred in silver and blue, and the steady rhythm of droplets against glass filled the room like a lullaby. Inside, the light was low, just the golden pool from a single lamp on the desk, its shade tilted slightly, making shadows dance lazily across the wall. The smell of chamomile and honey lingered in the air, warm and comforting. The cup sat half full beside a notebook that had not been written in for days. The narrator sat by the window, knees drawn up, watching the city disappear into mist. Cars passed in silence, their reflections shimmering in puddles. Somewhere, a train moaned in the distance. The sound mixed with the rain until it became one long sigh. There was peace here, but also a familiar restlessness, like a bird that couldn't stop fluttering inside the chest. They had promised themselves they wouldn't. Think about it tonight. That argument. That moment when the voice rose too high, when the eyes turned cold. But the mind, like the rain, doesn't always listen. It flows where it wants, revisiting corners long after we've tried to close the door. Their hands wrapped around the warm cup again, seeking grounding. The steam touched their face like a forgiving hand. The lamp hummed faintly. Somewhere under all that sound, a heart slowly tried to find its rhythm again. It had been a long week. Too many words exchanged too quickly. Too many moments of trying to prove a point instead of seeking peace. They had said things they wished they hadn't, and even now, replaying those scenes felt like dragging a stone across soft earth. There was an ache behind their ribs, not sharp, just dull and persistent. The way regret often is, the rain grew heavier for a moment, tapping harder against the window pane, as if reminding them to stay present. Each drop slid down, merging with another, until all became one smooth trail of silver light. They traced it with their eyes, following its path to the sill, where it disappeared quietly into the night. Outside, streetlights flickered in puddles. Inside, the room held its breath. The narrator could almost feel time slowing, like it wanted to give them a second chance. A pause long enough to choose something different this time. Peace isn't loud, they thought. It doesn't demand to be heard. It arrives quietly, waiting for permission to stay. They leaned back in the chair, letting the soft creak of wood and rain fill the space between thoughts. The old clock on the wall ticked in slow, steady rhythm. Every sound, the rain, the clock, the wind curling around the eaves, seemed to be whispering the same thing. It's okay. Let it go. They took a long sip of tea, feeling its warmth spread through their chest. The bitterness had softened with honey, just like anger softens when we stop feeding it. And for the first time that evening, their shoulders dropped, the jaw unclenched, and breath came a little easier. Beyond the glass, the rain went on falling, endlessly, gently, like forgiveness written across the night. The heart can be noisy, even when the world outside has gone still. That night, as the rain continued its slow hymn, the narrator felt that quiet war inside, the clash between wanting to forgive and wanting to be right. It wasn't a loud anger anymore. It was a restless ache, a pulse that refused to settle. They could still hear the echo of that conversation, words thrown like pebbles into a pond, rippling far beyond their intention. They stared at their reflection, faintly mirrored in the window. The rain distorted it, breaking the image into tiny fragments. That felt fitting. That was how their heart looked too. Not broken, just unsettled, scattered. It hadn't started as anger. It never really does. It began as disappointment, then grew legs and learned to pace inside them. They remembered every gesture of that evening, the tense shoulders, the clipped tone, a half smile that didn't reach the eyes. Sometimes, peace doesn't leave all at once. It slips away, one small misunderstanding at a time. The rain deepened, filling the gutters, tapping against the metal railing like quiet percussion. The sound was hypnotic, yet their thoughts wouldn't follow its rhythm. They kept circling back to the same question. Why did I let it go that far? Anger is strange. It makes us feel powerful for a moment, then empties us completely. They thought of the words they had said, sharp enough to leave tiny invisible scars. They thought of the silence that came afterward, thick and heavy. They had walked away that night feeling justified, and yet somehow defeated. Now, in the calm hum of midnight, that victory felt hollow. The tea had gone cold. The notebook still lay open to a blank page. A tiny drop of rain had slipped through the slightly open window and landed right on the paper, leaving a dark circle that slowly spread outward. It looked like a small universe, born and fading in seconds. They closed their eyes and listened harder, not to the rain, but to the quiet behind it. There was always something underneath the noise, a gentler truth, waiting to be noticed. And it whispered, you can't rest until you release it. They inhaled deeply, held it, then exhaled through the mouth. The air felt lighter than before. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the beginning of softness, a small surrender that lets the heart breathe. The room smelled of wet earth and candle wax now. The air had shifted. It felt like a deep sigh after hours of holding tension. They stood and walked toward the window, letting their fingertips rest against the cold glass. Drops slid under their touch like tiny streams. They imagined each one carrying away a fragment of resentment, washing it down to the street below. Their reflection looked back, tired, yes, but gentler. There were lines under the eyes that hadn't been there years ago, lines carved by laughter and pain in equal measure. Life had been generous with both, and tonight it seemed to offer a choice, to keep feeding the fire or to let the rain do what it always does. Cool, cleanse, renew. They whispered softly to the window, though no one was there to hear. I don't want to be angry anymore. The words didn't echo, didn't need to. They dissolved into the sound of rain and became part of the night's quiet pulse. And somehow, that was enough. The phone lay on the desk, its screen lighting up briefly with a soft glow, a message notification. For a moment, the narrator's pulse quickened. They didn't have to check to know who it was from. The same name that had burned behind their eyelids every night since the argument. They hesitated, eyes fixed on that faint blue light pulsing in the dim room, like a small heartbeat waiting to be acknowledged. Their fingers moved toward it, then stopped. The rain outside whispered louder. Something in its rhythm said, not yet. They reached for the phone anyway. The message was short, not cruel, not kind, just a question that could have been an opening or a trap. Their thumb hovered over the keyboard, ready to fire back all the words that had been rehearsed 100 times in their mind. Every sentence came sharp, polished, ready to defend the heart, but something about the quiet, the steady sound of water against glass, the faint smell of tea leaves cooling on the desk, made them pause. They looked down at their reflection. In the black screen, and for the first time, saw not a victim or a fighter, but someone simply tired. Tired of trying to win, tired of explaining, tired of carrying anger that did nothing but burn from the inside out. The cursor blinked at the edge of the message box, impatient, as if asking, will you send it? Instead, they pressed the side button, and the light went dark. The phone, now just a cold piece of metal, was placed face down on the desk. The silence that followed felt heavier at first, then slowly, mercifully, lighter. They leaned back in the chair, the creak of wood filling the pause. Through the window, they could see the blurred shimmer of streetlights on wet pavement. It was almost midnight. Somewhere, a car passed, tires hissing on soaked asphalt. The world kept moving, indifferent to the storms that lived inside small human hearts. They let their eyes drift to the notebook again. The page with the rain spot had dried, leaving a faint ring like a memory of something that once existed. Without thinking, they picked up the pen and wrote across it. Some things don't need answers, only endings. The words came easily after that, flowing like the rain itself, slow, honest, unplanned. They didn't write about blame or guilt or reasons. They wrote about small moments, laughter shared on a park bench, the warmth of a hand held during sickness, the sound of their name said softly once upon a time. And then, the turning point, the night it all began to fade, not because of one big mistake, but because both had grown weary of trying to be understood without truly listening. Writing it down didn't fix anything, but it made space. A little more room to breathe, a little less pressure behind the ribs. The anger was still there, but it had lost its teeth. They signed the bottom of the page but didn't add a name. It wasn't a letter meant to be sent. It was a place to set down the weight. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far away. Deep, lazy, not threatening. Just a reminder that storms sound worse when they're close. They closed the notebook gently, as if tucking a restless child into sleep. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. And in the soft hum of the rain, something inside them began to unclench. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to breathe, enough to feel human again. The phone stayed face down. And for tonight, that was its own kind of peace. Long after midnight, when the storm outside softened into a gentle drizzle, the narrator found themselves drifting through old memories. Not the loud ones, but the quiet moments that time had polished smooth. There was one that rose clearer than the rest. A night long ago, in a small cafe lit by candles and steam. A friend had once sat across from them, hands around a chipped mug, eyes patient and kind. That evening had also followed an argument, a different one, but born of the same fire. They remembered the way their voice had trembled, how their friend had listened without interrupting, just stirring sugar into tea with slow circles. When they had finished ranting, expecting advice or agreement, the friend had simply said, "You don't always have to win to feel right." At the time, the words had stung. But now, years later, they came back like soft rain after drought. You don't always have to win to feel right. They could see the whole scene again, the yellow light glinting off wet pavement outside, the hiss of the espresso machine, the warmth of that unspoken understanding. The friend had smiled then, not because everything was solved, but because they had chosen to stay calm in the face of someone else's storm. That memory became a kind of lantern now, glowing quietly inside their chest. The narrator turned back toward the window. The rain had slowed to a thin silver mist. They imagined that friends somewhere under the same sky, perhaps asleep, unaware of how their simple kindness still echoed. Years later, it was strange how memory worked, how the heart chose what to keep. Not the harsh words, not the victories, but the small gestures of grace. The hand that didn't let go, the voice that stayed soft, the look that said, "I see you instead of I judge you." They sat in silence for a long while, letting that warmth settle. The air smelled faintly of rain and paper now, a clean scent that made the whole room feel reborn. On the desk, the tea had gone cold again, but it didn't matter. Its presence was enough, a quiet witness to the night's unfolding peace. Somewhere inside, a realization formed. The people who taught us the most about love often did it without grand gestures. They simply stayed gentle when it would have been easier to harden. The narrator smiled faintly. Maybe that was what they wanted to learn now. Not how to argue better, but how to stay soft longer. How to let silence speak without filling it with fear. They remembered how that friend had once said, "Kindness doesn't mean weakness." It means you care enough not to add more pain. And for the first time in a long while, those words didn't sound idealistic. They sounded possible. The rain whispered against the glass again, as if agreeing. Each droplet drew tiny paths of light down the pane. The world beyond was still blurred, but maybe clarity wasn't the goal tonight. Maybe peace wasn't found in knowing everything, but in letting some things remain unsolved, gentle, open, unfinished. They exhaled softly, their breath fogging the glass. A single word escaped their lips, half a prayer, half a promise. Enough. The sound vanished into the night, swallowed by rain. And yet, for the first time in a long while, it felt like the heart had heard it. The rain deepened again toward dawn, a soft percussion on the roof, like fingers drumming in thought. The narrator, wrapped in a wool blanket, watched the faint outline of dawn, trying to slip through the gray. The air was cool and smelled of earth, tea leaves, and quiet reflection. They found themselves thinking of their grandmother, a woman who had lived most of her life near the sea, in a small wooden house where storms were both a nuisance and a song. As a child, the narrator would sit with her on the porch whenever it rained, wrapped in the scent of salt and damp bamboo. The sound of the rain on the tin roof was thunderous then, but Grandma never flinched. "She's just talking," she would say, nodding toward the sky. The rain has things to say, too. Those were the moments the narrator remembered most vividly. Her steady hands pouring tea from a chipped kettle. The way her wrinkled fingers would drum gently on the cup while waiting for it to cool. Even then, the tea always smelled faintly of ginger and patience. One afternoon, after the narrator had come home in tears from a fight at school, Grandma had taken them to that same porch. The rain had been heavy that day, sheets of water slanting across the garden, the world outside dissolving into motion and sound. "Let it rain," Grandma said simply. "Don't fight with it. You'll get soaked anyway." She smiled, eyes half closed. Storms pass faster when we stop shouting at them. At the time, those words had felt like a riddle. Now, sitting by a different window, under a different sky, they made perfect sense. The narrator could still picture her, hair tied back in a gray bun, lips pursed around her tea, humming softly to herself as thunder rolled somewhere beyond the bay. There had always been a peace around her, a kind of quiet authority that didn't need volume. When she spoke, even the rain seemed to listen. They missed her terribly tonight. Not the way a child misses a caretaker, but the way an adult misses the map they once had and lost. That kind of wisdom doesn't shout. It lingers in the corners of memory, waiting for you to come back when you're ready. As the rain whispered outside, the narrator imagined what Grandma might say if she were here. Probably nothing profound, maybe just, "Drink your tea before it gets cold." But that simple sentence, said in her voice, could still loosen every knot in their chest. They smiled to themselves, the warmth of that memory spreading like a soft current through their body. Maybe that was what peace really was, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of something steadier, quieter. Like the old woman who never raised her voice at the storm, the blanket slipped off one shoulder, and they pulled it back, cocooning themselves deeper into its weight. The window fogged again from their breath, and outside, a street lamp flickered, its reflection quivering on the wet pavement. If Grandma had been there, she might have said, "You can't stop the rain, but you can decide whether to stand in it or sit under the roof with tea." And that, the narrator thought, was all the wisdom anyone needed tonight. They closed their eyes, letting the sound of the rain merge with the memory of her hum, that low, wordless tune that had always made even the heaviest sky feel lighter. Somewhere between the thunder and the heartbeat, they whispered, "I'm listening now." "Grandma." The answer came not in words, but in the way the rain softened, like the world itself exhaling. The house was quiet, except for the steady murmur of rain and the soft hum of the kettle beginning to boil. The narrator rose slowly, stretching as if shaking off years of tension from their shoulders. The air in the kitchen was cool. Each movement, opening the cupboard, choosing the mug, tearing open the packet of tea, felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. They filled the kettle, watching the water swirl before placing it back on the stove. It was an old ritual, one they'd learned without realizing. Brewing tea had always been more than habit. It was a small act of devotion to calm, a way of telling the body, I'm home. You can rest now. As the kettle began to hum, the sound melted into the background music of rain. The smell of damp earth drifted through the cracked window. They leaned on the counter, feeling the faint vibration of boiling water through the metal, a heartbeat rising to a gentle crescendo. When the whistle came, they turned off the flame and waited a moment, just enough to let the bubbles subside. The steam curled upward in a delicate spiral, touching their face with the warmth of something living. They poured the water over the tea leaves and watched the color bloom, soft gold turning amber, then deepening into the shade of honey at dusk. It was strange how much peace could be found in something so small. No words, no explanations, no need to be understood. Just the quiet rhythm of pouring, waiting, breathing. They carried the cup back to the window. The rain had settled into a soft drizzle, a whisper more than a storm now. The faint glow from the streetlights painted moving constellations on the surface of the tea. Steam rose like a ghost of memory, twisting and fading into the dark. They took the first sip, hot, earthy, a little bitter. It grounded them. Every inhale seemed to slow the heart a little more. The mind, once full of noise, began to clear. They remembered something a friend had once said, when you make tea slowly, you're not just making tea, you're teaching your body to trust the quiet again. That line echoed now, truer than ever. Each slow sip felt like choosing gentleness. Each exhale like forgiveness taking shape, wordless and real. The rain shifted direction, tapping against the other side of the window now, as if circling the house in gratitude. The narrator smiled faintly. There was something intimate about being awake when the world slept, something almost sacred in that. Solitude. They set the cup down, watching the ripples settle. Maybe this was what healing looked like. Not a grand moment of revelation, but a slow evening of making tea while the rain forgives the earth. The kettle clicked softly as it cooled, the sound small and domestic and perfect. They thought of all the nights they'd rushed through life, chasing closure or clarity, never realizing that peace could come disguised as an ordinary act. They reached for the notebook again, its pages faintly wrinkled from humidity, and wrote, "Maybe peace is brewed, not found." The ink bled slightly, forming soft edges around each word. It looked more alive that way, imperfect, human, like the person who wrote it. Outside, the clouds began to thin, and the faint outline of the moon appeared behind them, pale, patient, unbothered by all the storms it had seen. The narrator sat back, hands wrapped around the mug, feeling warmth pulse through the ceramic. And for the first time that night, they didn't need to think about what came next. They were already there, sitting still, breathing, alive inside a moment that finally didn't ask for anything more. By the time the clock neared 2, the night had settled into a deep, velvety calm. The rain had thinned to a soft drizzle, the kind that barely touched the window, but filled the air with its steady, rhythmic breath. The narrator leaned back in their chair, the teacup now empty, and simply listened. At first, it was just sound, the faint tick of water against glass, the hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of wind brushing past the eaves. But as they focused, each noise began to reveal its own voice. There was the light patter of droplets on the railing, high and delicate, almost like chimes. The deeper tap of water dripping from the roof into a puddle below. The distant roll of thunder that came and went like a sigh too tired to startle anyone. They began to name them silently: drizzle, gutter, thunder, whisper, echo. Each name softened the edge of sound, turning chaos into rhythm. What had once been background became a symphony. The mind, still tender from hours of thought, followed the music like a child tracing constellations on the ceiling. For the first time in many nights, they weren't thinking about what had been said or done. They weren't replaying scenes or arguments. They were simply here, in the dark, in the rain, alive within the soft pulse of the world. The air through the window was cool against their skin, carrying the faint scent of wet soil and night flowers. A gust of wind passed through the trees, and somewhere nearby, a loose branch creaked like an old floorboard. Even that, somehow, sounded kind. They closed their eyes. The rain became an ocean, the wind a slow tide. Every inhale seemed to draw peace deeper into their chest, and every exhale released something they no longer needed to carry. A memory surfaced, one of those small, easily forgotten moments. Walking home years ago in the rain, without an umbrella, angry at life, at everything, and then suddenly stopping because the rain felt good. Cold, cleansing, undeservedly gentle. That was the first time they'd realized the world could comfort without saying a word. Now, that same lesson returned, wrapped in the language of water. Maybe peace wasn't something to chase. Maybe it was something to hear. They opened their eyes again, the city outside cloaked in silver haze. The lamplight flickered through the mist, and a few leaves clung stubbornly to a tree that refused to let go, even this late in autumn. The sight made them smile. Quiet resilience was its own kind of beauty. Their fingers began tapping lightly on the table, following the rhythm of the rain. It was uneven, unpredictable, sometimes fast, sometimes barely there, yet somehow perfect. They realized that was what they wanted their heart to sound like. Not steady or flawless, but present. A single droplet rolled down the inside of the window, catching the reflection of the lamp before fading into nothing. They followed its brief journey with their eyes and whispered, "That's all any of us are doing, isn't it?" Falling, shining, disappearing. The words didn't carry sadness, only understanding. The night felt full, even in its quiet emptiness. Outside, thunder grumbled once more, a final exhale before rest. The narrator breathed with it, syncing their pulse to the rain's rhythm. Inhale, exhale. Listen, Dot, and in that listening, they felt the heart ease a little more. The noise of the world, the noise within, both softened into something almost musical. Dot peace, they realized, doesn't always arrive with silence. Sometimes it comes as sound, the rain teaching you how to stay, the wind reminding you how to let go. The notebook was still on the table, its pages half filled with quiet confessions and unspoken prayers. The rain had thinned to a mist, the kind that clings to the window instead of striking it. The world outside was pale gray now, somewhere between night and the suggestion of dawn. The narrator pulled the book closer, the pen resting across it like a waiting hand. There were words inside them that still hadn't found their way out. Not angry ones, not even sad ones anymore. Just words that had been too heavy to speak aloud. They opened the notebook to a blank page, smoothed it gently, and began to write. "Dear you." The first two words sat at the top of the page, trembling slightly in the uneven light. They weren't sure who they were writing to, the person they had argued with, or perhaps themselves. Maybe both. I've carried so much inside me, the things I said and the things I should have. The anger felt like protection at first, but now it feels like a lock with no key. I've kept it polished, thinking it made me strong, but it only made me tired. The pen moved slower now, each line deliberate. The sound of the nib scratching paper mixed with the faint rhythm of the rain. They paused, listening, letting silence fill the space between sentences. You once told me I was hard to love when I was angry. I didn't believe you. I thought love should withstand everything. But maybe you were right. Maybe love can't grow where there's no softness left. They stopped writing for a moment, staring at the ink drying under the lamplight. The words looked fragile, exposed. But there was something healing about seeing them there, outside the body. They took another sip of tea, now cool and slightly bitter, and continued. Tonight, I didn't answer your message. I almost did. I almost sent words I would have regretted. But something told me to stop. Maybe that was peace knocking, quietly asking to come in. So I chose silence instead. Not to punish, not to win, but because I finally understood that sometimes quiet is louder than any reply. The pen hesitated, then wrote the next line slower, like a whisper. I forgive you, not because you asked, but because I can't keep drinking poison hoping you'll taste it. Their breath caught after writing it. The truth of it felt raw, but right. They leaned back, exhaling long and deep. The rain outside sighed in unison. The page began to fill, not with reasons or justifications, but with gentle acknowledgments. Memories of good days, moments of laughter, small kindnesses that had been buried under layers of misunderstanding. It felt strange to see them again, like meeting old friends after years of silence. When the page was full, they didn't sign it. This wasn't a letter to send. It was a letting go, an offering to the night, to the rain, to whatever force had guided their hand back to softness. They folded the page once, twice, then slipped it between the covers of the notebook. It didn't need an envelope. The act itself was enough. For a long moment, they simply sat there, listening again. The house creaked gently, as if settling deeper into the earth. A stray droplet found its way down from the roof, hitting the sill with a quiet, perfect sound. They looked toward the window, the reflection of their face softer now, less sharp around the edges. There was still sadness, yes, but it had changed shape. It no longer demanded to be fixed. It only wanted to be understood. They whispered to the letter, to themselves, maybe even to the one they wrote to. Be well, wherever you are. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They floated out into the soft gray morning and disappeared, carried away by the last breath of rain dot. The letter rested inside the notebook like a closed door. The narrator stared at it for a while, fingertips brushing the cover as if feeling the weight of something invisible. It wasn't heavy anymore, not in the same way. It was a gentle kind of ache, the kind you could live with, like an old scar that no longer hurts when it rains. They stood and walked toward the small shelf by the wall, the one crowded with plants and old photographs. On the top was a small bowl of smooth stones, gathered from beaches and rivers over the years. Each one had been chosen for no reason, except how it felt in the palm. Cool, balanced, whole. They picked one up now, a dark gray stone shaped by time and tide. It fit perfectly in their hand. They sat back by the window, the stone resting against their skin, and thought of the anger they had been carrying Dot. It had felt like this, heavy but strangely comforting, something familiar to hold on to. There was a time when letting it go seemed impossible. Anger had been their armor, their proof that they still cared, that the wound was still alive. But tonight, holding that real weight, they saw it differently. The stone was beautiful because water had shaped it, not by force, but by persistence. Every soft wave had worn it down until nothing sharp remained. Maybe that was what forgiveness really was. The slow erosion of anger by gentleness. They turned the stone in their hand, tracing its smooth surface with their thumb. You can't throw this at anyone, they whispered softly. It's too soft now. The thought made them smile. They remembered the times they'd thrown words like stones, fast, unthinking. certain they needed to land somewhere to make the hurt make sense. But every throw had left them emptier. The target was never really outside. It had always been within. They closed their fist around the stone and breathed. With each inhale, they imagined drawing calm from the earth itself. With each exhale, they pictured the anger flowing out, dissolving like mist. After a while, their hand began to relax. The stone felt warmer now, as if it had absorbed something from them or maybe released something instead. They placed it gently on the windowsill, where the dim light from the street cast a faint halo around it. It sat there quietly, shining in its stillness. A small monument to a decision made in silence. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped. Only the occasional drop tapped against the roof, hesitant like a final goodbye. The air smelled clean, renewed. Somewhere distant, a bird stirred early, mistaking the soft light for dawn. The narrator leaned their forehead against the window. The glass was cool, grounding. For the first time in days, the reflection didn't look like someone haunted by unfinished sentences. It looked like someone who had survived the storm not untouched, but intact. They thought of how people carry invisible stones inside them, disappointments, regrets, misunderstandings, and how sometimes the bravest thing isn't to throw them, but to finally set them down docked in the stillness. They whispered, "I'm done carrying this." The words weren't dramatic. They were quiet, almost casual, but the effect was enormous, like releasing a breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding for years. The room seemed to exhale with them. The curtain swayed gently, with a breeze sneaking through the small open window. The stone glinted faintly, as if agreeing. They reached for their cup again, empty but fragrant, and smiled at its simplicity. Maybe peace didn't arrive with fanfare. Maybe it just came like this in small, deliberate acts of setting things down. They left the stone on the sill. Let the morning light find it. Let the world keep turning. Because tonight, something had shifted. The hand that once clenched had opened. The heart that once burned had cooled. And all that remained was stillness, quiet, patient, and new. The sky outside had faded into that deep, blue-gray quiet that comes just before dawn, the hour when the world hasn't quite decided to wake. The rain had stopped completely now. Only the faint dripping of water from the rooftop broke the silence, like the last thoughts of a dream reluctant to end, that the narrator sat with their notebook open again. The page was blank this time, waiting. But the weight in their chest was lighter, the kind of lightness that comes after tears you didn't realize you'd been holding back. They glanced at the phone on the table, still face down, still silent. It no longer felt like a test or a threat, just an object, resting. They picked it up, turned it over, and unlocked the screen. The last message still sat there, small and plain. "Can we talk?" For a moment, the cursor blinked in the reply box, patient and unjudging. The narrator thought of all the versions of themselves that would have answered differently, with pride, with sarcasm, with longing disguised as anger. They could almost hear those replies forming, the sharp lines, the hidden pleas. But something inside had shifted. Tonight, they wanted words that didn't wound, that didn't demand. They didn't burn bridges or rebuild walls. They wanted words that carried truth without fire. Their fingers hovered over the screen, then slowly began to type. "I need time to breathe, but I'm not angry anymore. I hope you're okay." They read it twice, once as the person who had written it, and once as the person who might receive it. It felt steady, honest. A sentence built not from hurt, but from peace. They hit send. The whoosh of the message, leaving sounded louder than expected in the quiet room. For a second, their heart raced, then slowed again. It was done not to reopen the wound, but to close it gently, like placing a hand over something still tender and saying, "You can rest now." They put the phone aside and let the silence return. It filled the room like water, filling an empty cup slowly, evenly, perfectly. The rain's absence made the stillness even deeper. It was as if the world was listening. The narrator's eyes wandered to the window. A soft, silver reflection of early light shimmered on the glass. They thought about words, how easily they can harm, how rarely we choose the right ones when we need them most. And yet, how even a single gentle word could begin to heal something broken. They thought of that moment earlier, choosing silence instead of reaction, and now, choosing clarity instead of pride. It felt like rewiring the soul, one small message at a time. On the notebook page, they wrote, "Sometimes peace isn't walking away. It's walking differently, slower, softer, without the sword." The line made them smile faintly. They closed the notebook again, not out of finality, but trust that the next page didn't need to be written tonight. The faintest streak of light slipped through the curtains, brushing the edge of the desk. The warmth touched their hand, still resting on the closed book. They thought of everything that had happened, the storm, the anger, the tea, the silence, the letter. None of it erased the past, but somehow it no longer owned them. Peace, they realized, wasn't the absence of pain. It was the choice to stop feeding it. They looked at the phone once more. No reply yet, and strangely, they didn't need one. Not every conversation has to end with closure. Sometimes it ends with kindness. The morning light grew stronger, spilling softly across the wooden floor. The world was changing colors, gray turning to silver, silver to pale gold. The sound of a single bird drifted in through the window, clear and bright. The narrator breathed deeply, the scent of rain and newness filling their lungs. Then softly, to no one in particular, they said, "It's enough." The words didn't echo. They simply settled in the air, gentle and whole, exactly as they were meant to be. The world outside had begun to pale with the coming dawn, but the house was still wrapped in that soft, blue hush that belongs only to early morning. The narrator sat quietly, both hands resting in their lap, eyes half closed. There was no need for words now, only breath. They began to notice the rhythm of their breathing, slow and uneven at first, then steadier, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Each exhale felt like letting go of something small. An old thought, a useless defense, a tension held too long in the shoulders. They placed one hand over their chest, feeling the faint beat beneath the skin. It was gentle but sure, like a small drum keeping time with the rain that had just passed. That steady pulse had been there through everything, every argument, every silence, every night spent overthinking. And still it beat. "Thank you," they whispered softly, not to anyone, but to the body itself. The body that had carried anger, fear, exhaustion, and never stopped breathing. The air in the room felt clean, as if the rain had washed it from the inside out. The faint scent of wet wood and cooling tea drifted around them. They let their attention travel slowly, to the rise and fall of their chest, the weight of the blanket over their legs, the slight hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Each detail anchored them deeper into the present moment. They remembered something an old book once said, "You can't calm the storm, but you can calm yourself. The storm will pass." It felt truer now than it ever had. The anger that once thundered inside had quieted, not because it was defeated, but because it had finally been seen. They closed their eyes again and traced the small path of breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Thoughts came and went, faces, words, flashes of the past, but they didn't grab onto them. They let them drift like leaves down a stream, moving gently out of sight. Their awareness wandered next to the jaw, loosening the grip of old tension, to the shoulders, where invisible burdens had sat for too long, to the chest, where grief had lived like a tenant who never paid rent. Each place softened under a tension dot when they opened their eyes. The light in the room had changed, not brighter yet, but warmer. The storm had moved on. The window pane, once streaked with rain, now caught the first hints of gold. They smiled faintly at their reflection in the glass. It was still them. Tired eyes, uncombed hair, traces of sadness around the mouth, but something was undeniably different. The lines of worry had eased. The gaze was calm, kind, even curious. "I forgive you," they whispered, though they weren't sure if they meant themselves, the other person, or both. Maybe it didn't matter. Forgiveness wasn't a declaration. It was a slow loosening, like morning light untangling from night. They stretched their fingers, rolled their neck gently, feeling the body wake with the world. Even small movements felt meaningful now, each one a reminder that life, however fragile, was still unfolding here. In this quiet kitchen, after the rain died outside, a single drop of water slid from the edge of the roof and landed on the windowsill with a soft plink. The sound was so pure it almost felt deliberate, as if the rain itself were bowing out with grace. The narrator reached for the warm mug again, empty, but comforting in their palms, and sat with it for a while, breathing in rhythm with the fading sounds of the night. Peace wasn't a grand arrival. It was this, the slow thaw of a frozen heart, the return of breath, the gentle awareness that nothing needed fixing right now. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the quiet didn't scare them. It felt like home. The window had turned from mirror to canvas. As dawn stretched across the horizon, the glass no longer reflected the darkness within, but the slow awakening outside. Pale light rushing across rooftops, still damp from the night storm. The narrator sat motionless for a long while, watching this quiet shift. And somewhere between the reflection and the view beyond it, they began to see themselves differently. The glass was still faintly fogged from their breath. When they leaned closer, the reflection appeared soft-edged, almost dissolving into the morning haze. For the first time, they didn't see anger in those eyes, or guilt, or even sorrow, only a deep tiredness mixed with something gentler. Compassion about the face looking back was familiar but new, as if shaped by the rain itself. It carried the same history, the same mistakes, but it no longer asked to be punished for them. It simply wanted understanding. They reached out, fingers grazing the cool surface of the glass. The condensation smeared slightly, blurring the boundary between inside and out. It felt symbolic, the invisible wall between who they were and who they were becoming, melting drop by drop. "I'm sorry," they whispered. The words weren't meant for anyone else. They were for the reflection, for the self that had spent so long trying to control, to fix, to fight what couldn't be forced. The reflection didn't respond, but the silence that followed felt forgiving. A memory flickered through their mind, standing in the rain as a child, crying after being scolded, and seeing their reflection in a puddle, tear-streaked, small, alone. They'd hated that version of themselves, wanted to wipe it away with their foot. But the rain had done it first, gently, without judgment. Maybe life had been doing the same thing all along, washing away the harsh outlines we draw around ourselves, until only what's essential remains. They smiled faintly. "You're still here," they said to their own reflection. After everything, it felt good to acknowledge that. Survival often goes unnoticed, buried beneath self-criticism and comparison. But there was something holy in simple endurance, in still being able to look at yourself and not turn away. They noticed the faint scar on their chin, the tiny freckle near the left eye, the small tremor in their lip that appeared when they were thinking. Imperfections, once hidden behind self-consciousness, now looked like proof of being alive. Outside, the clouds broke apart slowly, letting golden strands of light touch the tops of trees. The world was waking. Piece by piece, the narrator closed their eyes and pressed their palm flat against the window. The cold seeped through, grounding them. "I forgive you," they said again, a little louder this time, as if the heart needed to hear its own echo. They thought of all the times they had spoken harshly to themselves, the names they'd called, the ways they'd diminished their worth, the inner monologue that had said, "You should have known better. You should have done more." And now, for the first time, a gentler voice answered back, "You were learning. You're still learning." The warmth of that thought spread through their chest, soft and steady. They watched the reflection fade further as the light grew stronger. Soon, the glass would no longer hold their image at all, only the sky beyond it, the soft drift of clouds, the promise of another day dot. And maybe that was the point. Peace comes when you stop trying to see yourself perfectly and start seeing yourself as part of the changing sky. Flawed, beautiful, transient, free. The kettle clicked faintly behind them, a reminder that the world continues, even while we heal. They smiled at the sound, then turned from the window and whispered, "Thank you," to the rain, to the silence, to themselves. And the light, as if understanding, grew warmer in reply. The morning had fully arrived now, soft and golden, filtering through the sheer curtains like a quiet promise. The storm had washed the world clean. Even the air smelled different, lighter, like wet leaves and beginnings. The narrator moved slowly through the small room, bare feet brushing against the cool floorboards. Everything felt fragile, tender, as though the house itself were still waking. They poured a new cup of tea, this time without rushing, without checking the phone, without thinking about what to say next. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive. Sitting back at the desk, they opened the notebook again. Not the page with the letter, but a fresh one. The pen hovered for a long moment before the first line appeared. "Tomorrow, I will speak gently." The words surprised them with their simplicity. No resolutions, no grand promises, just a small, deliberate choice. They wrote again, slower this time. "If they call, I'll listen before I answer. If they don't, I'll still wish them peace." Each sentence felt like a pebble dropped into still water, creating ripples that reached quietly toward something unseen. The narrator paused, pen resting between their fingers, and thought about the difference between reacting and responding. How easy it was to live life like a reflex, to defend, to strike back, to prove, and how much harder it was to stay open, calm, awake enough to choose. That, they realized, would be the practice. Not just for tomorrow, but for every day after, to choose differently. They took another sip of tea. The warmth slid down their throat, grounding them in the present. On the windowsill, the small stone still sat where they had left it, glistening faintly in the morning light. They smiled at it. Maybe they'd keep it there, not as a relic of pain, but as a reminder of transformation, a symbol of the weight they had once carried and the peace they had decided to keep instead. They looked around the room, seeing it anew, the faint steam rising from the tea, the soft folds of the blanket still draped across the chair, the light turning everything golden. Even the mundane felt sacred now docked in the quiet. A thought came gently. Peace doesn't stay unless you keep choosing it. They wrote that down 2 dot, then they added another line beneath it. Kindness is a skill. I will keep practicing. They could almost hear Grandma's voice in those words, patient, amused, proud. The echo made their hearts swell. The clock ticked softly. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once, and then the sound of a broom sweeping across wet pavement followed. Life returning. The narrator closed the notebook and sat back, fingers curled around the cup. They imagined the day ahead, the people they might meet, the faces they might see. There would be opportunities, big and small, to lose their temper, to retreat, to shut down. But there would also be chances to stay soft, to breathe, to choose peace again and again. They thought of what it might feel like to meet the person they had argued with, The image didn't sting anymore. It felt almost ordinary. They would smile, maybe exchange a few quiet words, maybe just nod. It didn't need to be perfect. The point wasn't to fix everything. It was to live differently inside the same world. Finishing the tea, they rose and opened the window wider. The air swept in, cool and bright, brushing against their skin. It felt like being baptized in sunlight. They whispered to the empty room, "Today, I'll try." The curtains swayed gently in reply. Outside, the branches glittered with tiny drops of light, the last remnants of rain holding on before falling to the earth. They watched one drop release itself, catching the sun as it fell. And that, they thought, is how peace moves through. U.S. One small act, one quiet moment, one gentle choice at a time. By the time the morning stretched into full light, the rain had completely gone. The sky above the rooftops was a clean, unbroken blue. Not bright yet, but calm, like the quiet inhale before a song begins. The narrator sat near the open window, wrapped once more in the soft gray blanket. The air drifting in was cool, carrying the faint sweetness of wet earth and the faraway hum of city life resuming dot. It felt strange to realize that the storm had lasted all night, and yet inside them, something deeper had changed. Not all at once, not with a flash of revelation, but gradually, quietly, the way night dissolves into morning without ever announcing its leaving. They looked around the room, the lamp still glowing faintly, the teacup half empty, the stone glimmering where sunlight caught its curve. Everything looked exactly the same, yet it all felt new, as if peace had rearranged the air itself. They leaned back and closed their eyes, breathing deeply. The scent of rain lingered on the windowsill, soft and familiar, like a memory refusing to fade. Sleep tugged at them now, not the restless kind that comes from exhaustion, but the tender, safe kind that follows understanding. The kind that says, "You've done enough for tonight. You can rest now." They pulled the blanket tighter and let their thoughts drift, the way clouds do after a storm, scattered but free. Faces appeared in the soft blur behind their eyelids. People they had loved, lost, hurt, and forgiven. Some smiled, some simply looked at them in silence. And instead of guilt, they felt gratitude. Every person, every pain, had taught them something about the shape of their own heart. Forgiveness, they realized, wasn't about letting others off the hook. It was about unclenching your hand so your heart could open again. They could still hear the faint drip of water somewhere outside, the rain's last breath, perhaps. The sound was soothing, almost like a lullaby. Peace, they thought, had never been about changing the world outside. It was about learning to sit in your own storm and still keep the candle lit. They tilted their head toward the light. The warmth brushed their face like a hand cupping their cheek. For a moment, they remembered the beginning of the night, the anger that burned, the phone that glowed like a wound, the words that almost left their mouth. How strange it felt now, that version of themselves. Not shameful, just distant, like a character in a story they had finally finished reading. They smiled faintly. "You did your best," they whispered to that earlier self. "You can let it go now." The words were barely audible, but they carried weight. They felt them settle inside, grounding, real. The clock ticked in the corner steady, unhurried. The world beyond the window stirred with life. The rustle of leaves, the low hum of traffic, a child's laugh echoing faintly from somewhere down the street. It was as if the world, too, had decided to move forward gently. The narrator's eyes grew heavy. The edges of the room softened. The rhythm of their breathing fell into sync with the morning's quiet pulse. Just before slipping into sleep, a final thought floated up, clear and calm. Peace is not a place you find. It's a choice you keep making, one heartbeat, one breath, one morning at a time. The blanket rose and fell with their breath. Outside, Sunlight glimmered through the last lingering drops on the glass. Inside, stillness settled like dust in warm light, gentle, forgiving, whole. And as sleep came, it felt not like an ending, but like a soft continuation, the heart resting. The storm remembered only as rained out when the narrator woke. The world was gold. Sunlight streamed through the curtains in gentle ribbons, spilling across the floor, painting everything it touched with warmth. The storm had done its work. The sky was clear, the air fresh, the trees outside dripping with diamonds of light. For a moment, they stayed still, caught between sleep and waking, the remnants of dreams mingling with the scent of morning tea that still lingered in the air. There was no rush, no reason to move quickly. Peace, once something to chase, now felt like a presence quietly sitting beside them. They rose slowly, wrapping the blanket around their shoulders, and walked to the window. The glass was clean now, every trace of the night's rain gone. Below, the street shimmered with puddles, reflecting the blue of the sky. A bird hopped along the fence, chirping softly, unconcerned that the world had been drowning only hours ago. The narrator smiled. It was such a simple thing this quiet morning after, but it felt like the most profound gift. They leaned on the windowsill, letting the sunlight warm their face. In the distance, someone laughed. The sound drifted up like a melody, effortless and human. The kind of sound that reminds you life keeps going, even when your heart once felt like it couldn't. The stone on the windowsill caught their attention, the same smooth gray one they had held through the night. In daylight, it gleamed softly, almost translucent. They picked it up, turning it between their fingers. It was lighter than they remembered, or maybe they were stronger now. They took a long breath and whispered, "Thank you," though they weren't sure if they were speaking to the stone, the rain, or the version of themselves who had stayed awake until peace found them. The world outside sparkled, tiny puddles glinting like mirrors. In one of them, just beyond the window, the sky reflected perfectly, white clouds drifting across a patch of blue. For a long time, they just watched Dot. It struck them how everything, even a puddle, even something born from a storm, could hold the sky if it stayed still enough. That thought lingered, simple and luminous. Maybe that's all I need to do. Stay still enough to reflect the light. They set the stone back on the sill, beside the cup that now caught the morning sun. It looked like a small altar, a monument to all the versions of themselves that had once shouted, doubted, resisted, and still, somehow, arrived here. They turned away from the window, stretching slowly, feeling the body wake with gratitude. There was no tightness now, no rush to fill the silence. Just breath and movement, and the quiet pulse of life. They thought again of the one they had argued with, of the words left unsent, the message sent softly instead. They didn't know what would come next, whether there would be reconciliation or distance, but somehow it didn't matter. What mattered was this: they had learned how to choose peace, even when anger had been easier. And that choice had changed everything. Dot, as they stood there, sunlight warming their back. They realized that this moment, this simple, ordinary morning, was what healing looked like. Not grand, not cinematic, just the quiet knowledge that you made it through the storm and didn't lose yourself along the way. They poured another cup of tea and sat down again, facing the open window. Steam rose in soft spirals, merging with the light. The sound of a broom sweeping the street drifted up from below, rhythmic and grounding. The day had begun. They took the first sip. It tasted different, somehow cleaner, lighter. Like the rain had washed the bitterness out of everything, even the leaves. And as they drank, the thought came not loud, but certain. Like a truth the heart already knew. Some nights are meant to break you open, not to hurt you, but to let the light in outside. A puddle caught a perfect reflection of the sky. The wind passed through gently, and for a brief second, everything shimmered: water, glass, breath, light before settling again into calm dot, and there, in that quiet moment, the narrator smiled. Because peace, finally, had stayed.